we have so many funding mechanisms that we've been experimenting with. I, as Allison mentioned, come from the Protocol Labs community and network, which is really an innovation network for accelerating R&D. I spend most of my time in the digital human rights pillar of the Protocol Labs network, but today I'm going to actually talk about the new mechanisms that we've been experimenting with, evolving tools for in the economic and governance system evolution track of the Protocol Labs network. As I'm sure all of us feel today, we have extremely inadequate governance systems, extremely divided, not scaling and evolving to contend with the challenges we have today. We also have inadequate economic systems. These are things like the fusion never result, where we just haven't coordinated the large-scale funding to collectively get to really good outcomes, instead making local economic decisions in markets that don't end up collecting the resources for those sorts of results. And cryptoeconomics is a really useful set of tools for experimenting and trying new systems, new economies, and creating new ways of coordinating individuals and groups to actually do that large-scale funding coordination, governance coordination, et cetera. So I want to profile 3 sets of experiments that we've been running in the Web3 ecosystem, and also a lot of these examples are not just Web3-oriented, calling out also the amazing work that Foresight and others are doing, around community-governed funding systems, places where you're engaging a large-scale community and getting the intelligence of local context and understanding to feed into funding decisions, things like prizes and prize splitters and impact markets as a tool that many groups have been experimenting with for funding public goods. And then also some of the new things that we're piloting in the Protocol Labs Innovation Network around composable funding primitives and actually building out networks of funding mechanisms that can recursively fund each other and form kind of a neural network of resource flow. So in that first category, from a community perspective, one of the things that's been kind of innovated on from a grants program perspective is using quadratic funding to have large-scale funders be able to harness the expertise of a community to allocate a grants pool and resource effectively. Gitcoin Grants has been trying this for many rounds. I think we're at like Gitcoin Grants round 16 or 19 or something amazing. And so there's been a lot of iterative evolution here. 50 million plus donated towards public goods through these grants programs. And it allows, and this works really well when you have a community that's able to provide signal and help larger scale funders flow resources. It doesn't necessarily do a great job of raising lots of additional community funding and really organizing many different funders. But highly recommend this if you have a grants program and you don't necessarily have a community of experts that can identify all of the opportunities to deploy. Another really interesting experiment that's been happening in the DAO space, decentralized autonomous organizations, is around community-governed treasuries. This is becoming more and more common, where you have a community voting on new proposals for how to allocate funding within their ecosystem of different sizes. And there's been some really good experimentation here. The biggest drawback of this sort of experiment is participation from your community. AI is actually becoming an interesting tool here, where you can do auto-summarization and pros and cons of a particular proposal, which can allow more direct governance by a community over individual proposals for funding or resource allocation. One of the areas I'm most excited about is retroactive public goods rewards, or retro PGF, which has been experimented with and really pioneered within the optimism community in Web3, but is now prevalent across the entire space. We actually just ran a retro PGF round in Filecoin. There's an ongoing one in the P2P ecosystem. And this does a very good job of really harnessing a large-scale community to surface opportunities for funding. And it's a much easier funding decision because you can look retroactively at the impact being created. You can be much more precise about the characteristics of good impact. And you can use this to fund entire economic value flows, like in Optimism, it's collecting sequencer fees and coming directly from the Optimism kind of rewards ecosystem and funneling it back into the early stage public goods funding that helps grow and expand that community. And so this would be a really interesting thing to think about, say, at a nation state level, where you have a pot of public goods funding that is coming straight from your kind of GDP or economic systems being distributed and governed by a community in a more open access way than maybe governments do with their budget planning today. All right, in the next category, this is around things that maybe help our tools for creating markets or more composable primitives. Obviously, there's a ton of work that's been done around prizes and awards, from the Nobel Prize, Future of Life, X Prize, and some of the other prizes that were being shared yesterday to really help galvanize work within a field and create a North Star that teams can build towards with the chance for a significant funding payoff. DRIPS is actually a really useful tool that we've seen developed in the open source ecosystem, which allows you to do the splitting of those sorts of rewards amongst a large-scale community of participants. DRIPS in particular works mostly with GitHub and open source projects, where you're funding individual contributors to a repository, but also all of the dependencies of that repository, trying to help avoid the left pad sort of incident where you have a critical dependency that's many layers lower in a stack and then ends up not being well maintained. And so this you can just configure, and any funding that flows to one project would then flow into its dependencies. Folks here might be familiar with the concept of carbon credits. These are kind of impact tokens for carbon emissions. They've been used heavily in the kind of like wider space for taking the work done around carbon sequestration or carbon avoidance, and then enabling large-scale industries to pay a separate set of parties that are doing that sequestration work, but offset the carbon that they are then emitting as part of their manufacturing process or something similar. We've seen this used pretty heavily in the Filecoin ecosystem by storage providers that want to be using clean energy sources and want to be offsetting any of the energy work that they do, and this is a very growing market. We've seen it also kind of tokenized, and the provenance of those carbon credits put kind of in verifiable mechanisms in Web3. If you're familiar with, from that concept, you can also generalize that primitive to hypercerts. And I think we have Holke in here. If you want to know more about hypercerts, go talk to Holke. But the concept here is it's a generalized tool for impact certificates, where instead of choosing just carbon and sequestration of carbon as your impact, you could choose any type of impact, from planting a tree to hosting a phenomenal event like this that causes so much valuable flow of ideas and a new generation of them in the world. And this can then be a composable primitive that allows grants, programs, bounties, prizes, many different types of markets to form. And the really interesting concept here is that you're helping bottle up all of the impact created, so that many years from now, we can have a different understanding of how valuable that work was than our current understanding today, and flow those rewards back. And this creates a market opportunity in the same way that we have a capitalist market opportunity over equity and shares in companies in the production they're doing. We can do the same thing for impact, and hopefully end up with more funding and more resource allocation to the things we really care about that maybe we struggle to value in our capitalist economies today. Last but not least, I wanted to call out some of the new, more experimental work we are doing around composable funding primitives and networks of recursive funding. So when you think about network funding, we're drawing a lot of lessons learned from things like the internet, from neural network design, routers and splitters of value, and neurons themselves. And so when we think about thinking of that model in traditional capitalist markets, this is where you have chains and layers of LPs in funds, in fund of funds, and that eventually go to gaining equity and then being able to flow either the equity or the capital returns from equity back to all of those LPs. You end up with this chain. If you want to see more about that, Juan has a great talk about it on YouTube. I'm not going to go over it here because I don't have time. But we want to replicate that for impact capital and impact markets where you're able to flow the credit or thanks or impact certificates back through chains of funders, chains of donors, so that you can have a recursive structure of funding funds that you care about, which then fund funds that achieve that submission, which then actually go and fund projects or individuals or other things like that. And so we structured this so that there can actually be a neural network style learning process over who is effective at allocating that capital in order to achieve that impact. And to do that, you need to have a backprop of who is successful at allocating the capital well. So we've been setting this up inside the Protocol Labs network. We have both what we call green funding structures, things that kind of work in your traditional capitalist VC models, and also blue funding structures, or things that are public goods funds that are chains of impact funds focused on different sub-purposes within a vision. And one primitive that we've been using for this is the Open Impact Foundation, which is a network of organizations that allow building charitable foundations and very easily creating sub-foundations focused on different specific purposes and governed by communities of advisors. So this is effectively a legal structure as a public goods router of funding, which allows many different funders to come in, join forces, and then fund many different aligned projects, or recursively fund many sub-funds that are focused on different subsets of the mission or goal. So you can have an OIF cell funding other OIF cells, funding other OIF cells, all the way down. And so we've used this actually in practice in, say, the libp2p community, where we have multiple different funders and LPs who are all funding the libp2p core cell, and then the core cell can actually run multiple different types of funding mechanisms, can fund other subcells like the private retrieval fund that is helping build kind of obfuscation networks and things that help with censorship resistance in the libp2p community. And the aim here is that there's collective funding mechanisms that can gather both all of the different teams. There's like, I think, $30 or $300 billion that is depending on top of the libp2p protocol at this point, because pretty much every blockchain network in Web3 uses this as their peer-to-peer networking library. And so that collective funding mechanism can allow harnessing these resources and then distributing it again as a community. Wanted to call out the FROs. We're going to talk about that in just a second. And these are also fantastic and doing a similar structure where there are many different FROs that are being kind of housed and incubated from inside Convergent Research, which helps all of these new projects get 501c3 status and be able to achieve their missions very efficiently without having to reinvent the entire wheel. And so that kind of like, structure of trees of organizations that can be focused but can exist within a wider network structure, we think is incredibly powerful and incredibly able to fit a varied landscape of different problems you want to achieve, which is why we're putting these tools to work and experimenting with it. So thank you, and excited to talk more about how this innovation network has come to be and how we're continuing to evolve it.